We are back for another race weekend. A little earlier in the week than usual with the race preview episode, and before we actually see cars on track, but still plenty to talk about as we head into the Bahrain Grand Prix weekend. We saw dominant wins by Max Verstappen in the last two races at this track. He won last year by 22 seconds over his teammate Sergio Perez in second place. In 2023, he won with an 11-second lead over Perez in second. Can Max make it 3 wins in a row at this track and 2 wins in a row for this season? The bad news for Max and Red Bull is the hotter temperatures at this track should bring their car back down to earth a little bit. We're coming off a weekend where tire wear was a complete non-factor, but it should come back into play this weekend with warmer temperatures, and that's probably going to hurt Red Bull more than the other top teams. Now, the good news for us, though, is these hotter temperatures should mean more excitement. We've just had colder than usual races to start the season. Australia was the one hot one, but at the same time, all of the rain during that race obviously cooled things down. But the hotter temperatures this weekend should mean more tire degradation, which should mean more excitement on track. Now, Pirelli has gone for the hardest 3 compounds for this weekend, like we saw at the last race in Japan, so that should help a little bit, but not completely. We won't see drivers doing qualifying laps every single lap like we did in Japan. We'll see some tire management, we'll see a bigger difference in performance from car to car, and we'll see some different pit strategies. And because of all of this and how things usually go at this track, a 2-stop strategy is very likely, but a 1-stop might still be possible and will probably be attempted by some teams, which is always music to a Formula One fan's ears and usually makes the race better and more exciting. Going to the circuit itself, though, what do we know about it, and why do the characteristics of this track open the door for a much more exciting race? It's just a better racing track where you can actually pass, so we shouldn't see a repeat of what we saw in Japan last weekend. We have 3 DRS zones, and historically 65% of the overtakes at this track have happened in these DRS zones, so there should be a lot of action there. The slow and medium speed corners, though, will be where the difference is made between the field. There are some high-speed corners at this track, but drivers should be able to take them flat out, so we likely won't see a big difference in performance there. But the 2 areas of the track that'll make the most difference come at Turn 1 and Turns 9 through 10. Turn 1 is obviously coming off the long front straight, so drivers have to get their braking points right going into that first corner, or else they can really throw off the rest of their first sector. We'll probably see some cars going long into this corner in the practice sessions as they try to figure this out, but they'll have to have it dialed in by qualifying. Turns 9 and 10 are tricky. Turn 9 is a little kink that you can take at a decent speed, but then you're right there on Turn 10, which is almost a hairpin. And it is really easy to have some oversteer in Turn 10 and go too deep, and we'll probably see that throughout this weekend, maybe even into the race a little bit. But what hurts drivers the most is the long straight that follows these 2 corners. So if you get these 2 turns wrong, you can end up losing a lot of time in that second sector. Watch out for the wind this weekend too. Bahrain can be a very windy circuit, which can obviously make the cars more unstable and loose in the corners. But at the same time, if the wind direction changes from qualifying to the race, that could change a lot and pose some difficulties for the drivers. Now, I've always wondered this with these tracks in the Middle East and how they don't have problems with sand blowing onto the track. Didn't know this until prepping for this show, but apparently they spray down the sand around the track with this sticky adhesive substance that basically prevents the sand from blowing around. So, pretty cool fun fact about Bahrain and some of the other tracks that we see in the Middle East. Going back to the race, though, there's a good chance we get a safety car at some point, which we haven't had since the opening round in Australia. But 4 out of the last 5 races at this track have had a safety car, so a high likelihood of that happening during the race, which can really shake things up depending on the timing. Now, we've obviously seen cars on this track already this year with preseason testing back in February. But if you're going into this weekend, looking at the results from preseason testing and thinking, okay, well, they finished in this order in preseason testing, so that means they'll probably finish in that order this weekend, stop yourself. Don't do it. Don't let those 3 days of testing fool you. Not saying you can't learn anything from preseason testing, but we have completely different conditions this weekend than we had back in February. It was cold for testing. Unusually cold for that part of the world. It even rained a little bit, which hardly ever happens out there. But now we're back to typical Bahrain weather where it's hot and it's dry, and that changes a lot with these cars. But on top of that, too, just the general nature of preseason testing, teams aren't even required to run legal cars during testing. So again, there's just not a lot you can take from those 3 days that translates into the actual race. So again, as easy as it is to do, don't fall into that trap. Some predictions for the weekend and ultimately the race, though. I think realistically, we have 4 drivers who could have very strong weekends and ultimately win this race, as long as we don't have any freak situations with accidents or retirements. And those drivers are Max Verstappen, George Russell, and of course the 2 McLaren drivers of Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. The McLarens should look better at this track than they did in Japan, considering the warmer temperatures and what that should mean for the tires, and I think that will give them the edge in this race. But at the same time, when that car looked head and shoulders above the rest after Australia, Lando came out and said, well, if this race was at Bahrain, we probably wouldn't have won. So it does give you some pause. But it is worth noting that Lando tends to be wrong with these personal predictions of his. When he says the car will be terrible, it's usually great. When he says the car should be great, it usually struggles. So maybe his pessimism for this track is good news for McLaren heading into this weekend. My gut feeling is Red Bull will struggle more at this track because of the warmer temperatures. As great as Max was last weekend, the cold weather in Japan was such a huge factor that helped with that car's performance. And he'll just have to manage the car more for this race. But the higher tire degradation is why it might be a tough weekend for Red Bull. We've seen their car struggle more than most in this department so far this season. But with all that being said, I just can't count them out. One thing that has Max on my radar this weekend, even with these expected issues, is his ability to make changes to the setup of the car in the middle of the weekend that solves all of their problems, or at least enough of their problems to be competitive. We started to see it last year when Red Bull started to lose its way and struggle, but there have been so many instances where they show up on a Friday and the car looks terrible, and then overnight Max influences changes to the setup of the car, and they show up on Saturday and it's a completely different story. And we saw that again in Japan last weekend. There's a report that came out that Max and Rudy Van Buren, a sim racer and close friend of Max, put their heads together in the middle of the Japanese Grand Prix weekend, figured out how they needed to change the setup of the car, and those changes were a big reason why Max was able to win that race. It makes you wonder if he's really starting to figure out a way to navigate and work around all of the problems this car has had. And it's actually insane that we've had 3 races and 1 sprint race, and that Red Bull car has been universally accepted by the media, the fans, and even Red Bull as not being great. And here we are with Max in second place in the standings, only 1 point behind Lando. And that includes Lando finishing in the top 2 in every race other than the sprint race. I've said it before, I'll say it again, and I'm sure I'll say it plenty in the future. You just can't count Max Verstappen out. And he's earned every bit of that reputation. I don't think you can count Mercedes out of it for this weekend either. Now, Kimi Antonelli, he has been really good, but he looks like he still needs more time before he's actually competing for race wins. But George Russell has been great this year and very consistent, and he could be in the mix if the McLaren struggle more than expected. If you're a Ferrari fan listening, you're probably hoping I'm here to tell you that they'll magically show up this weekend and have everything figured out and they'll be competitive again and might even win the race. And you might have some hope looking at last year's race and how well Ferrari performed finishing P3 and P4. I don't see much that gives us hope that they'll turn it around this weekend. There's one thing to watch, and that's this new floor upgrade that's in the works. We've talked about it before, but Ferrari's in trouble with their current floor. They can't run the cars as low as they need to get the most performance out of the car because it can lead to disqualifications like we saw with Lewis in China. Now, there have been rumblings that Ferrari might bring this new floor this weekend. Apparently, there's a split within the team where some are worried they might be rushing the upgrade and it might backfire on them. So keep your eye on that in the coming days because that's something that could change things for this team this weekend if they do get it right. Going to Lewis's side of the garage, apparently he had a separate issue with a spring in his car, which was bothering him the last 3 races that they just discovered. So that should be fixed too for this weekend, which is good news for him, and also explains somewhat the difference in performance between himself and Leclerc. But a new development with this team that's concerning, for me at least, is Leclerc coming out and saying he's going in a different direction with the setup and development of his car to suit his driving style a little better. We talked about it in the season preview, but Charles and Lewis have different driving styles. Charles likes a car with more oversteer. Lewis likes a car with more understeer. So it's not really a surprise that they're going in different directions, but this is going to hurt the team. It makes things really tricky for the team. Most of the time when we see teams develop their cars and bring upgrades, it's for both cars and things stay the same. Maybe you get an off weekend where one car has the new upgrade and the other doesn't, just because of the team managing costs and development time. But that upgrade eventually comes for the second car at the next race weekend. But when you go in different directions with development between the two cars, you lose continuity, and it can add more costs to the team, which can be crucial in this budget cap era of the sport. But even more detrimental for a race weekend is just losing the ability to share data between both sides of the garage. When a team shows up to the first practice session and they're struggling with performance, they can say, okay, driver 1, let's make these changes on your car. Driver 2, let's make these changes to your car, or even maybe keep yours the same so we have a baseline, and we'll figure out which direction is better from there. Ferrari's losing that with this decision, and each driver will essentially be on their own to navigate these difficulties with their respective cars. It is an expected move by Leclerc and ultimately the team, considering the two different driving styles with these two drivers. But they're drivers that are well established in the sport, and you expect them to have their say with how these cars are set up. But it's a move that will definitely cost Ferrari in some way down the line. Finishing up, I think a number of drivers have some pressure on them this weekend. The first, of course, being Jack Doohan. It's extremely obvious now that he's at risk of losing his seat. You hope he has more time to change some minds at Alpine, but the decision might already be made, and it's just a matter of time while they let contractual obligations play out. He's had 2 major crashes in 3 race weekends, so he's already cost the team financially, but the results just haven't been there either. P19 DNF in Australia, a P13 in China that was really kind of a P16 if you don't count the 3 disqualifications, and a P15 in Japan where he had cars lined up behind him that just couldn't get around him. He needs a strong weekend from the Bahrain Grand Prix, and maybe even a points finish to save himself with this team. You have to say Yuki Tsunoda has some pressure on him this weekend too. A disappointing weekend for him last weekend in Japan, but I think a lot of people are giving him somewhat of a pass considering the lack of tire wear in that race and just the difficulties everyone had with passing other cars. But that's gone this weekend. And with Max performing as well as he has been with the team, they're going to be looking for a strong performance from Yuki. Now, I do worry a little bit that last weekend was actually worse than it looked on paper for Yuki. The Red Bull didn't look great the first 2 races, but in Japan, everything came together and Max was able to pull out a win. So was that P12 for Yuki actually a little worse than it looked? Might be. And if the car's performance dips again this weekend and say Max can only muster a P5, how far down the grid does that put Yuki? Now, the good news for Yuki is the qualifying really hurt him in that race last weekend, and everyone can see that. But other than that mistake in qualifying, he was able to keep up with Max throughout that weekend. So if he can get qualifying right and at least stay close to Max, that should take some of the pressure off of him. The pressure's lessened a little bit, but it's still there for Liam Lawson. I don't think he needs to worry about Yuki anymore. Let that whole saga go. Act like he's not there on track, because the real comparison for him now is with his teammate, Isaac Hadjar. Liam can't finish 45 seconds behind him again. He needs to at least be close, if not ahead of Isaac. And as good as Isaac has been this season, other than that Australia incident, Yuki was outperforming him, and that's what the team is going to expect out of Liam. There's starting to be a little bit of pressure on Carlos Sainz too. Not that he's at risk of losing his seat. The team is still thrilled that he signed with them. and he's not going anywhere anytime soon if they have a say in things. But Alex Albon has completely had the upper hand in everything this season. Albon is 4-0 against Sainz in qualifying, including sprint qualifying, and he's 4-0 against Sainz in races, including the sprint race. The results are honestly just starting to get shocking. I don't think anyone expected Sainz to jump in this car and have it all figured out right away. There was always going to be a learning curve. But you expected him to have it figured out by now, or at least show signs of figuring it out. And that just hasn't been the case. And I think the heat gets turned up a little bit this weekend, considering how strong the Williams looked in preseason testing, which again is dumb. It should not be used as a measuring stick going into this weekend, but the media cycle can be dumb, and someone is going to use that argument. So again, this isn't a lose your seat situation or anything close to that, but we need to start seeing something out of Carlos Sainz. My podium predictions for the race: in P3, George Russell; P2, Lando Norris; and P1, taking home his second victory of the season, I have Oscar Piastri. The McLarens look like they should be back on top, but as we've seen every weekend with these two drivers, the order that they finish in qualifying plays such an important role. It's so close between them, literally coming down to hundredths of a second in qualifying. But whoever is the top driver out of qualifying is likely the lead driver after the first lap of the race, which usually means that driver is in clean air, and usually means that driver gets the preference for pit stops, which can and has decided who wins the race between these two. But last weekend, Lando had the edge, and I think it flips this weekend. And I think Oscar finds himself in that advantageous position and gets himself onto the top step of the podium. It was tough to figure out where to put Max in all of this, but I do think we'll see Red Bull struggle more than Mercedes with race pace and with tire degradation, and that's why I have George finishing ahead of Max in third. But I do think Max will be right behind him, maybe even P4. I don't expect much out of Ferrari, unless they do bring that new floor to this weekend. But if they don't, I almost expect them to finish behind Kimi Antonelli in the second Mercedes car, with all of the problems that they've had with their car lately. So again, a lot comes down to that floor upgrade. But I do think we'll see a big difference between Ferrari and the top teams this weekend. All right, that'll do it for today's episode previewing the Bahrain Grand Prix. More of a weekend preview than a race preview. Again, we haven't seen cars on track yet, but keep an eye on that throughout this weekend. I do think we will be able to take a little more away from the practice sessions than we have at other race weekends this season. But I do think, I'm not going to say exciting, because I was very wrong about that last weekend, but a more exciting race than we saw in Japan last weekend. I will, of course, be back on Sunday with a recap of everything that we saw in the Bahrain Grand Prix, and hopefully we have much more to talk about than we did after last weekend's race. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Until next time.